Fellman, when I was doing the interviews for the Shoah Foundation, she asked me if I would be interested in doing these interviews of local citizens for the Historical Society. I agreed to do them, and we've done quite a few up to now. It's probably a unique collection. I don't know that any other Jewish historical societies are doing this. We hope to build a pretty good-sized library with a cross-section of people here in Omaha, Lincoln, Council Bluffs, and Nebraska, and so on, to really get something that goes back possibly even 100 years. Families that migrated here in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and how they got here and what the family has done since that time. So it's been, I think, a unique experience for me, and I think it has for these people too. I've never run into anyone that didn't want to be interviewed, and the ones that are interviewed, I think, are pretty pleased with the results.
I applied, mind you, this was in my lifetime. I applied to Columbia University with my 1 year of advance at the University of the City of Toledo, and I was refused admission with the credits from Toledo. And I went to our vice president in charge of academic affairs, and he said, "That's crazy." He says, "We always send transcripts to Columbia." He said, "Well, let's go to the president." We went to the president of the university. And he said, "I can't understand that." He says, "We always send students to Columbia." "Oh," he said, "are you Jewish?" I said, "Yes." He says, "I can't do a thing for you. You've run into their Jewish quota." Now that's, mind you, this is in my lifetime. So this would have been in 1933. No, 1930.
How did that particular event affect you at that time?
Oddly enough, as I look back on it, I wasn't particularly affected. We looked upon it as natural that Jews were discriminated against. And this was as recently as that, 1930. And we had no clout. Just think, for example, in the years of the Shoah, in the years of the destruction of European Jewry by the Nazis, American Jews didn't have enough clout to do any real protest. We should have ended all activity in Washington, at least that. We could have lain on the streets. We could have stopped the airport. We could have done all sorts of things. We didn't. American Jews just didn't feel that they had a clout as recently as that in the 1940s. As I look back on it now, I'm very much ashamed of it. More than that, I was already in the rabbinate at the time of the Shoah. And as my son pointed out to me later, why in the world didn't the rabbis do something about it? Why didn't the Jewish community do something about it? We did nothing. Nothing real, nothing substantial. We just didn't feel that we had the security to raise our voice. It was as recent as that that American Jews felt that they had a little sense of power and a sense of duty to lay themselves out if necessary.
I was enrolled in Central High School. There were many Jewish clubs at the time, but the Jewish kids were not familiar with me as a Jewish person, and so I wasn't asked to join the Jewish clubs that were in existence at that time. Myself and several other girls formed a club called the Bas Ami. We were kind of reject girls, and we formed this Bas Ami, which is the daughter of my people, and we wanted to help all the other Jewish organizations to come together. And so we were in existence for a good number of years and had many reunions, and it was a good organization, I thought.
My dad was in the junk business, and he would have a few cars, too, to sell, but he never learned to drive. I think he was frightened. Just never learned to drive. My brother Abie, when we wanted certain things like fruit, the big thing was go down to the city market. My brother Abie would take him. And then, of course, when Abie went into the Army, then I was I was already about 20 years old, and I was married. And I got married when I was 19, and Jack was 21. And the biggest thrill for me was to take my dad to the city market. And he loved it, so he could continue to go there and talk to some of his friends that had stands there. I can just remember all of that.
Those days, you weren't afraid to walk. It was a mixed neighborhood. There were blacks and whites. And you went. Nobody bothered you. Came to the store. My dad used to have the store. He was open, I remember, 7 days a week. Monday through Friday, he was open from about 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 at night. On Saturdays, he was open from 8 to 10. On Sundays, he used to work from 12 to 6. And I remember the store, in the middle of the store was a big, not radiator, but a big place where the heat came up. And on the cold days, we all gathered around the heat so that we'd stay warm. On the hot days, there was no air conditioning. We used to have ceiling fans. I remember my dad used to take his shirt off and operate in with his undershirt on.
Leo Ochsner, who was my very dear friend who had the farm at Sutton, Nebraska. And I started hunting with Leo's dad, and Leo wound up hunting with Leo's grandson and great-grandson. Opening day of pheasant season, there used to be about 12 or 15 of us that would show up. And by now I'm the only one left, and I still go out. Did last year, hope to go again this year.
And we would drive over to Phil Giles, near beer or whatever it was, and my father would get a near beer, and we'd sit in the car and we would eat the sandwiches, and we would have root beer. All three of us kids would have root beer. And then we would drive to South Omaha, where my father's cousin had a grocery store, Joe Goldware. He had a store at 2301 Madison. And we'd drive all the way to South Omaha on Saturday night. This is when I was a kid, you know, growing up, and you didn't have air conditioning in the car, and the smell of South Omaha was humongous. And my father would have the window open, and he would say, that really smells good, doesn't it? And then we'd go to the store of Joe Goldware, and Joe Goldware would still be open. He'd have a grocery store, and they lived on top of the store. They had a sort of an apartment up there. And he wrote poetry. And he would read my father the poetry that he wrote during the day when he wasn't busy. I mean, this was a whole, every Saturday kind of a thing that we did. It was a sort of a tradition with them that the two cousins, they were first cousins, would see each other, they loved each other, and would talk about how the business went today. It was a very interesting relationship.
I'm not a hero. I don't want children thinking of me as a hero, because then they'll think that only heroes can do good things. And it's the common people that can save the world. I was just doing what I needed to be doing.
It was a very exciting period of my life. I've loved it. I've loved every bit of it. I've made wonderful, wonderful friends. I've traveled to places I never would have gone to before. I've seen how Washington works. I've seen how, maybe a little bit more of how Israeli politics work. And I've had friends in numerous in Israel and France and England and here in the States that I never would have had otherwise. I've seen the families have been brought in. I've seen them resettle, and I've seen their children grow, and there are scholarships, and we have doctors and scientists and everything. It's been a wonderful part of my life. I can't imagine having done anything else. To see it and not do anything about it is worse than knowing about it and letting it sit by the side of the road. I'm pleased I was a part of the resettlement effort, and I hope it doesn't happen again in the world for the Jewish people.
I come from very wonderful people. My dad, who's Hyman Gus, had a second-hand store, and the last place was 24th and Parker, the old Levison store that probably means nothing to anyone, 24th and Parker Street. But we learned something from my father. My dad always reminded me of, I can't think of his name, there's this Russian immigrant, self-taught, no formal education, but he's considered a philosopher on the West Coast. Maybe you know who he is. I don't remember his name. If you ask my dad what time it was, he just will sit down because he's going to give you a little philosophy to go with it. Dad's always preached to us the importance of taking care of your family and always making sure that you help your fellow man. A few months ago, Pauline, my wife, told me something that pleased me quite well. She says, you know, she walks at the West Roads, and I do too, when I'm not at the center. And my good friend is Tretiak, who's walking, and he had to be walking with her. And he says that my dad was like the old Godfather in the olden days, as poor as we were. We didn't know we were poor because everybody else was poor, so we just felt we were all in the same boat together. But if anyone ever needed anything, he said, go see Hyman Gus, he'll help you. And I've always been proud of that because every Passover was a big thing to us. Even after I got married, we always had lots of people. And he said, our table cannot be complete until a stranger was invited to the home, someone who needed the thing there. And I consider myself really lucky again in this fashion that I come from wonderful poor people. And the reason I say that, you would say, Normie, you got to be nuts that you come from poor people. But I've learned so many important things that money is far from being the most important thing. Most important thing that I've learned from my dad is love, respect, and the dignity that goes with it. Help your fellow man wherever you possibly can. And I always remember what he used to tell me. He says, make a cheshbon. He made like a T, like a ledger sheet. And then he says, put down on the right-hand side all the good things that happened to you. On the left-hand side, the things you did for other people. And at the end of the day, if the right-hand side is far heavier than the left-hand side, you really haven't done a good day's work. He says, you have to balance it out by helping your fellow man. I never really knew what he meant until I got older. And then as I became older, I realized the importance of something like that.
We lived on the street wasn't paved, it was a dirt street. And we used to walk to shul on all the high hallways. We had to walk with my father. We walked to and from the
Which one?
synagogue on 25th and Seward.
Okay.
My grandparents lived on 21st and Burdette. And so from shul, we used to go over there, have a lunch, and then we'd walk back home to 25th and Spalding. My grandparents belonged to the Beth HaMedrash HaGadol synagogue on 19th and Burt. And so then we'd walk over there once in a while also. I went to Tech in 1934, graduated in 1938, and I wanted to be a bookkeeper. I took bookkeeping and accounting in high school, but I applied for a few jobs, and a couple jobs couldn't get because I was Jewish. And one Jewish man told me he couldn't hire me, I should go to work for my father.
On my dad's side, there were also 6 kids. His father died in about 1922, and my grandfather Nowitzki was a pillar of the old Rosh Hashanah Shul on 18th in Chicago. And if you look at the deed, which the Nebraska Jewish Historical Society has a copy of, they'll show his name is signed when they started building the shul on 18th in Chicago. And after he died, all the years, I can remember my grandmother up in the balcony, and we'd go for Simchas Torah, and we'd all sit, and all the festivities that took place there.
Up in North Omaha, you know, the kids we played with, and I can't remember all of their names now because it's been a long time ago, but when we moved down to South Omaha, just like the north side, it was kind of like a ghetto. There were a lot of Jewish families that lived down there, and we, you know, made friends with all of them. Schlafer's Meat Market was just about a block away from us, and there was Bronstein's Grocery, and there was Alex's Clothing Store, and there were, you know, all those merchants were within a matter of maybe 5-6 blocks. But I became very friendly with the Schlafer family, so as did most of our family. There were a family of about 6-7 boys and 1 girl, and my friend was Dave Schlafer, and he and I were in AZA together, and then there are other brothers, Phil and Joe. They had 2 sets of twins, Phil and Joe, and Irving and Willie, and I tell you, they fought with everybody in the neighborhood. I'm talking about knockdown, drag-out fights. I remember one time I was over there at their place. They lived in the back of the butcher shop, and I'm sitting in this, in front of the screens of the back window, and Joe and Phil were having a fight like you wouldn't believe. I mean, I've never seen anything like that. And they ran outside, and all of a sudden, one of the Dave says, "Yale, duck," and one of the twins had thrown a brick through the window, and I just ducked. Time otherwise would have hit me. But they were, you know, they were really quite a family. Most of them are gone today, unfortunately.
I was born in Kaiser's Esch, Germany, near Koblenz, in the year 1934. I lived there until I was almost 4 years old, when my family and I immigrated into the United States and settled in New York City. I have very little recollections of Germany. The only thing that I can remember is the back of my grandfather's house, where there was a little stream running through. After many years, we did go back, and I did go to check out the stream. It was still there. However, it was much closer to the house than I had ever imagined. I thought it was way far away, but that was the interpretation of a 4-year-old. My parents decided to come to the United States because things were very tough in Europe, and these stories that I am going to tell are basically what they have told me, because I can't remember, I was too young. My father had his license taken away from him. He was a cattle dealer, as most of the German Jews were. They no longer were able to get kosher meat. They were no longer able to shop at the general stores. They were not able to do a lot of things, as well as travel from where they lived to where their parents were. Life was very difficult for them, and they decided it was time to leave. Most of both my father and mother's families remained in Germany. They did not have the foresight that my parents did.
There is so much Jewish history and so much tradition in Omaha, and the legacy just goes way back. And very often we fail to stop and recognize where that history has come from. We take for granted that it's just here because it's here. A great place for our teens to be a part of this is to go back into their own families and find out how their relatives and their ancestors had a part in Jewish Omaha, what their accomplishments were, and how they are linked to themselves, to their own family, so that it can kind of hit close to home. What this does is this sparks an interest to tell the story further. And really it is the responsibility of our teenagers to do so, because they are the link to our future and they are the next generation. It's their responsibility to go ahead and tell these stories.
At that particular time in my life, Sidney Epstein was my closest, I would say he's my closest friend at that time. And he became very active in Renee Brith. I said, Sid, I don't have any time. I'm back here, got to get the business going and so forth and so on. So he finally became president. I said, okay, Sid, I'll do one job for you. One job that might take a month. I'll give you that much time. Because all I ever want to do is really, I love this car business. So what job? They gave me fundraising. So I put on a big carnival, very, very successful. There's some money in the treasury yet that I put in. I made the first cash positive treasury. We raised a lot of money. We snored the material stuff. We had those booths, you know, with the wheels. We had a dance. We had a carnival. We had a dance. We had a auction, a whole celery. And I'll tell you, I loved the work, because when I came back from the service, Ben, I was amazed in my relationship with various people in the service that they had a very bad misconception of Jews. All Jews were in business. All Jews were rich. There was no poor Jews. There were no Jews that did any hard labor. There were no Jewish farmers. We were all nothing but entrepreneurs and businessmen. So I made up my mind that if I did any service, I was going to do it so they know a Jew was doing it. And B'nai B'rith turned out to be that vehicle. I've been active for 50 years. I'm still on the board. And I love the work. I love it. I still participate.
I was busy at Wolf Brothers store, starting at 16th Street in the Hill Hotel, and then moving across the street to the Aquila Court building. From there, I opened up a ladies' store on 72nd Street, and then moved up, and then opened up another Western store in conjunction with the ladies' store. I finally closed the downtown store and moved the Western store to 70th and Dodge, and moved the Western store out of 72nd Street and put in a junior department in there. So we had the Wolf Brothers ladies store was on 72nd, and Joey's Girls on 72nd. And the Western store was on 70th and Dodge. we forgot, no, we opened up a store in Council Bluffs in 1976, I believe, and Bill ran that store. When we bought the store at Westroads, we moved Bill to Westroads, and he ran that store, and Dick ran the store in Council Bluffs. When I first started the store in 1991, the store on 16th and Howard in the Hill Hotel, we did about $65,000 a year business. But I made enough money to be able to support my family. But what I used to do, I used to go to all the square dances around small towns in Nebraska and Iowa, and I used to go to horse shows on weekend. My wife was very upset about that, and she said she often thought that maybe she should leave me because I left her all the dirty work to raise the kids. But she did a good job with the boys, so I really can't complain about that.
I was always proud of the fact that they were very American. Neither spoke with an accent, which for some reason was important when I was a little girl. We lived in not a Jewish neighborhood, as a matter of fact. We lived around 30th and Webster, California, in a neighborhood that really doesn't exist anymore. All of my friends were children that went to St. John's and whatever other parochial school was close by. As a result, I did not know Jewish children, didn't have Jewish children as friends until I got to high school. But we had a good Yiddish flavor in our home. Mother kept a traditionally kosher kitchen, as my grandmothers did. And came holiday time, we did the traditional things. Our seders, I remember as though it were yesterday. They were very traditional. They seemed to go on forever, but they were real seders. They had a beginning and a middle and an end, and you didn't get up and leave the table until my grandfather said, okay, that's the end. The high holiday time, I remember walking with my mother. My dad would go early to the synagogue, which was the Litvische Shul, it was called fondly. Beth HaMedrash HaGodel, I think, was its formal name. Dad would go early, as did my grandfather, and I think probably schlepped along a fairly unwilling brother of mine to go with the grown men folks. Mother and I would follow a little later. We walked. We certainly didn't drive, not in those days. And we did the traditional things. Every holiday was marked properly.
My dad was a junk peddler. I think today you would call him a scrap metal recycler or a scrap metal dealer. He had a horse and a wagon, and in our backyard on 22nd Street, besides a horse, my mother had a cow. She would milk the cow for us to provide milk. We churned our own butter. We had about 100 chickens in the backyard, which for our own benefit provided us with eggs and chickens to eat occasionally. And we also had some pigeons, if I recall. But when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I remember that we had a break-in in our barn, and somebody tried to steal the cow and the chickens, but they didn't get away with it. And at that time, my parents decided to get rid of them. The only thing they kept, of course, was the horse, because that was my dad's livelihood.
Now, in the early years, my father had a horse and wagon, and he went out into the country and bought scrap iron and from the farmers, from probably old farm machinery or whatever they had, and he'd go out and spend all week in the country, and if he bought any, he would go to the nearest railroad station and put it in a gunny sack, any of the scrap metal, and send it to Aaron Farrer in Omaha. And he would then come in for the Sabbath. He'd come in on Friday, probably afternoon, and then he'd be going out again the next week. And I guess he was very fairly treated by the Farrer people. And after that, he got a kerosene route in which he delivered kerosene to the families in Omaha. That was beyond the power line, so that was the way they cooked and lit their homes. And he had a horse and wagon with a couple of tanks on it, and I remember as a child seeing those tanks. He had them laying around our old grocery store on Vinton Street. I don't know why they happened to be there, but they were. But his days in the oil business ended when I think the big oil companies started selling direct and cheaper than he could, and that was the end of that business. And what he did was he then was able to purchase a grocery store on 16th and William Street, and he was there for several years, and then he bought the grocery store in 1525 Vinton Street, right on the corner. And so that was where he spent the rest of his business life.
At the age of 1 month, my parents moved to Woodbine, Iowa. So my first 18 years were spent in a small town in Iowa, Woodbine, approximately 1,200 people, and we were the only Jewish family in the town. My first recollections at the age of about 4, where the house was, the first recollection is the house that we lived in. It's an old frame house, typical small town, corner lot, big, half the lot was a big garden, and we lived 3 blocks from Smearn's department store. In the small town, a department store was 1/2 groceries, about another half dry goods and shoes, and in the back of the store was a room that we candled eggs in to see that they were fresh, the eggs that we bought from the farmers. We had a battery that we kept chickens in that we bought from the farmers, a battery being a set of cages, and we also bought cream from the farmers. In the early years, before I spent much time in the store, I remember just playing with my sister Sarah, who was 2 years older, and being babysat by my sister Florence, who was 8 years older. Our home was always full of music. Florence was a marvelous pianist. There was always music going on in the house, and when Florence would babysit with us, she would play the piano and play songs, and the contest was to see whether Sarah or I could guess the name and the person that wrote the song, see who could win that. And she'd play a phrase or two of the song, and we would come up with the name of the song and the person's name that wrote the song. In those days, our entertainment in the wintertime was radio. In the evenings, we read a lot of books. We spent a lot of time in the libraries. And, of course, in a small town, we did things that I don't believe the city kids did for recreation. We would, in the summertime, families would get together and take walks out in the country, 2-4 mile square walks. We roller skated. We didn't have a swimming pool in the town. We had to go 10 miles to the next city at in Dunlap, Iowa, to the swimming pool, which we did when the parents would take us in the summertime. But as I got older, some of my friends and myself would go to the sand pit and swim. Of course, our parents didn't know that. It was a very deep, clear sand pit. And we'd sneak out there and go skinny dipping. As I grew up, I spent a lot of time in the store. Mother worked in the store all the time. She'd get up in the morning, get us kids off to school. She'd go to the store. We'd come home from school. She'd come home, fix dinner. During the Depression, in the 30s, I remember the customers coming to town in horses and wagons. Nobody had any money. Nearly all the farmers that came to town had to charge their groceries. And if they were able to, they'd pay us twice a year, when they'd either sell their crops, or they'd sell their cattle, or they'd sell their hogs. And Dad became the advisor and more or less the savior to all these farmers. They all looked up to him. They thought he was great. And he often told the story when he first moved there and opened the store, people came and stared at him because they'd never seen a Jew before. They expected to see somebody in a black frock coat with a black hat. And there was a pretty good German community there. And one of his longtime customers came in the store just after he opened, and he asked Dad if he could speak German. And Dad spoke Yiddish and understood German, and he told him yes, he did. He says, well, then I'll trade with you. And he became one of his dear friends because Dad would speak to him in his Yiddish German, and he would speak back in German. Growing up in this little town and being Jewish was a completely different upbringing. I always knew I was Jewish. I was very aware. My parents made me always be conscious of the fact that I had to be more honest. I had to be above anybody as far as morals were concerned, because we had to let people know that we were good people.
Told my mother when I was 6 years old that when I'll grow up, I'll find a job in a big town. I'll go to America and I'll bring her over, and all my wishes come true.
Really?
I came in 1970. Right. In 1922, I had my mother, my father, and 7 brothers and sisters. They lived with me 3 years till they learned how to talk. Yeah. Then they went to work. They all ran in business, and we were all successful.
You got them all over here.
And my mother was the Queen of America, just like I promised her.
My father got busy and became a peddler. He peddled into the country, and one of the farmers asked him how much the order was that he bought, and my father told him. He said, well, what is your name? And he told him, Joseph Morgenstern. And the farmer said, well, I can't, that name's too long. You just got to change it. You either make it Morgan or Stern. So he made it Morgan. So that was the name that we all wound up with, and I always loved it. However, I personally resented the fact that he changed it from from Morgenstern to Morgan because I loved, even from childhood, the name Morgenstern, meaning morning star.
I think most of the people living there were working people, with the exception of my father, who owned a clothing store pawn shop, and Mr. Barry, who lived halfway down the street. No, his name was Berger, not Barry, and he owned an ice cream manufacturing plant in South Omaha. I guess really the first memory that I have is when I had my tonsils out, and I was just a very small child. I can remember that I had been given, maybe as a result of having the tonsils out, a wooden cannon that would shoot little wooden pellets. And I remember when the doctor came in, it was at the St. Joe Hospital, I've been told. He came in the door and I shot him with the cannon.
The city didn't go much further west than that. Over in the Washington School area, of course, we were right next to Elwood Park. And I grew up literally in the park, walking with the other kids, walking the trails. It was a very adventuresome place to be. And straddling, running along the creek there and running through the tunnels. When I look back at it now and look at it, it doesn't look very big, but in those days, why, it was a great place to play. And that literally was getting to the western edge of town. But the neighborhoods themselves, as I say, were very well established by then.
The main thing about working, and I don't care whether it's here or it's any place, is to learn things. It's just like going to university or going to school. You have to understand things, you've got to learn things. Every customer is different, you got to handle every person is different. And if you can look at and learn the psychology of people and so on and so forth, that to me is very, very important. And it's everyday living, that's all it is. It's just facing reality, and it's everyday living, that's all it is.
The programs of the Nebraska Jewish Historical Society are made possible by the many tireless volunteers and the board of directors. The Nebraska Jewish Historical Society receives their funding only through memberships and donations. We receive no funding from the Jewish Federation of Omaha.